Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Build Canada Live. I'm Lucy Hargreaves. I'm the CEO of Build Canada, and I'm super excited today for a conversation about housing with an incredible advocate for housing and somebody who has worked for a long time in the space, really knows what she's talking about, Julie Di Lorenzo, who is the president of Mirabella Developments. Welcome, Julie.
Pleasure to be here.
Great. Julie, you're a longtime Toronto developer. You're also the author of 2 Build Canada memos on housing, calling for zoning reform and faster approvals. Canada's housing system, I think many of our listeners would agree, is pretty stuck right now. Prices have soared, approvals sort of drag on for years. And you've been arguing that outdated zoning rules, not the lack of land, are really the root cause here. Considering you've spent decades actually building homes in Canada, what made you want to write these memos and put forward your ideas for a plan?
Well, I've been in the real estate business since 1982 and have worked through multiple recessions. And this time it's structurally more broken than it's been before. So these memos are essential for us to solve the problem. And housing to me is really the underpinning of the commercial enterprise success of any place. And we definitely have neglected housing for a long time.
And I'm curious, just to think back, you've spent decades in the system. What moment in your career, when you reflect back, made you realize that the problem isn't necessarily money or willpower, but really a more systemic problem itself?
Well, because you saw such a long runway of success that everything got piled on. And everyone said, oh, well, it will just keep increasing prices. Oh, you got increased DCs, we'll just keep price, your project takes too long to get approved. Oh, we'll just add the interest carrying costs to the project till you hit a wall. And so this has been going on as far back as when I did a project in the 90s, that structurally there was no incentive to improve approval processes. And it was just an accumulation of the industry being used as a cash cow. And that's exactly where we find ourselves now.
And you've said Canada needs to cut approval times by 60% and increase housing starts by 50% in 5 years. From a builder's perspective, because this is what you sort of live and breathe every day, from your perspective, what's the single biggest bottleneck that's holding us back?
How we got here in terms of the quagmire, it's not just the approvals. People are focusing on just the zoning, which right now, frankly, I think the municipalities have woken up and said, uh-oh, we've got to get these files through. It's the inconsistency between departments. It's not unusual for you to have a planner say, this is fine, check off the box, and then you're waiting for another approval process from someone that should be interconnected. I'm not going to name names, but for example, a company that provides public transit or a company that's a utility. And it goes on and on and on. And there's no incentive in that department to get it fixed because it's sort of a silos that runs parallel to the city approvals. These city approvals up until now have been exhaustingly long, and interest carrying costs just accumulated and accumulated and accumulated. And that's where land prices went. But now you've got another problem that there's nobody collectively dealing with all these secondary approvals. They just sit there.
What's the average, like for a big development in Toronto, as an example, like, or the GTA, how long would a developer be waiting for approvals?
Well, we know that a multi-unit project in the past from probably land acquisition would have taken longer to approve than to build. And that's just crazy. I mean, out of a 7-year cycle, let's say from start to finish, it would have probably been 3 years of approvals, 3 years of construction, and 1 year of moving people in.
And has that changed? Like, what if we look back to, how we did developments 30 years ago, just to give people a bit of context here, like, has that, I'm assuming the answer will be yes, that has changed, but I'm just curious, like, what did that look like 30 years ago?
Well, let's just say that a little project that I did at Roxborough and Yonge, a 7-story building, took 3 years to approve. Plus, I had to go to the courts twice, and it's merely 30 units near the subway. So that's completely unacceptable. And what that did is it actually made wealthier housing, because when you have all these cost inputs, you have to sell at a certain price. So what's really happened is these processes have caused wealthy neighborhoods to exist on main streets. instead of that's exactly where affordable opportunity should exist.
Okay, pivoting out, I like to take a lot of our memos at Build Canada, sort of look at what other jurisdictions are doing to contextualize what's happening in Canada within a broader global context. The memos that you wrote point to places like New Zealand, Japan, Minneapolis that reformed zoning and as a result saw a housing boom. And what can we learn from those jurisdictions?
Well, I think one of the main examples, and I know this is probably the most delicate topic that no one wants to address, is the foreign investors. And if I can touch on that.
Yeah, go for it. There's no topic we won't talk about here.
I remember distinctly that, and I think it was Australia in particular and Singapore, when they needed to revitalize housing. Australia, for example, placed a restriction on foreign buyers on new inventory only. That makes 100% sense to me. New inventory creates jobs, creates a new tax base. It's a win-win. To not allow investors in the new home inventory will never get us the results we need. So, for example, we know we need over $1 trillion to meet our housing needs. Those monies are not available locally. And so if we do not introduce something that stimulates new housing construction with foreign investors, we will never meet our targets. And so Australia has a proposal that you are able to invest in real estate as a foreign buyer if it's new product. And no one has a problem with taxing speculation. I don't think I've heard any reasonable person in our industry that doesn't say, if you're a flipper, it doesn't help anybody. Tax. The flipper, tax people that don't hold on to the assets, tax people who don't have any intention of contributing to the housing inventory. But when someone has proven that they're an investor and they're creating units, assisting us in creating units by investing, and they hold on to their properties, that's a very, very good economic contribution.
That's interesting because that's certainly not what the sort of policy conversation is in many parts of this country.
Well, unfortunately, the policy conversation needs leadership. And what happens with the knee-jerk reaction is blaming every single party that isn't here or that isn't able to answer to the point. And first it was blaming the industry. Now the industry is clearly everyone appreciates the industry is needed in terms of solving the problem. Then it was, blaming the foreign buyer. Well, I'm not quite sure that's the reality because even CMHC admitted that the rental inventory stock that was being created was being facilitated by investors. So now that the problem is starting to be known, I think we're starting to revisit some of the things and the convictions that were premised in terms of what caused the problem. And that's not at all what caused the problem.
You talk a bit in your memos about rewarding cities that build more homes. And I'm curious what a true incentive structure would look like for cities. How do we make growth something that cities actually want?
So this is really one of my peeves, tax increment financing. No one ever gave credit to the intensification that has happened. That is for sure revenue positive tax assessment. So for example, we built 750 units on 1 acre of land. That would have taken exponentially a lot more acreage in the suburbs. And that tax base is very, very efficient. It's one set of trucks come, all the deliveries are within 300 feet, not acres. And so what inherently the intensification rewards the municipality already with a substantial new tax base. So that already should help mitigate development charges. And any intensification on public transit should be development charge free because you're not only making it efficient for the services, but you're also allowing people to save net household income to not have to have a vehicle. So it's a win-win. You're improving quality of life for people. You're increasing your tax base efficiently on public infrastructure. And that's how I would say would be the first major step.
Yeah, I mean, and densification is something that a lot of cities say that they want for, it's not often conveyed in the language of a more efficient tax base, but it's often conveyed in the language of, densification for climate reasons or for better access to public transportation or traffic regulation and movement in the city. It's interesting to hear you say it from a tax efficiency perspective.
So here's a typical example of when the silos of information are not speaking to each other. I read a piece this morning about the housing needs, and it was skewered to low rise. So there's a reason for that. Of course, everybody wants a low rise home, but low rise was something that was questioned in terms of tax efficiency in terms of servicing over 20 years ago, but we're revisiting it without the context of why low rise isn't always the answer. But here's the paradox. If we want to do 2 and 3 bedroom units in the city of Toronto, the development charges are substantially higher. So it's really not true that the municipality wants 2 and 3 bedroom units. If they have the highest tax development charge on the 2 and 3 units, those should be completely flipped. Development charges should be used to actually, we want 2 and 3 bedroom units. Those should be no DCs.
What happens if we don't fix this? So, I mean, just pivoting off what you just said about the regulatory system and what you said in the memo, that our regulatory system was engineered to prevent new homes from being built, which is a bit of what you just conveyed there. What's the risk to Canada's economy if that remains true, if we're unable to fix this and get the homes built that we need to get built?
Well, I'm finally seeing the majority of people, including the thinkers, the policymakers, understanding to see past the number of units that are being delivered in the next couple of years to a severe shortage in 28, 29 and beyond. And when you don't have housing, it's pretty obvious you can't have nurses working in the best hospitals in the world. You can't have municipal services because people have to drive into areas. So if we don't get this housing corrected ASAP, it takes 5 years from start to finish to get something built, very likely in terms of now, in terms of approvals, maybe sometimes 7. If we don't start in 2026, nothing will be ready in 2029. And we know that in Ontario, starts are way, way down. What we won't be able to do is have people work at salaries that institutions can afford because they won't be able to live near their work. And on top of that, if we believe that immigration is a positive for the country overall, when the immigration numbers do resume, we won't have anywhere for people to live.
Is tied to productivity and growth in the long term.
Absolutely related. And there are countries, and I think it's Singapore, has more affordable units per capita. And I think we could all argue that Singapore is a powerhouse in terms of capitalism. And
Yeah.
so Hong Kong too used to, I don't know their data now, but had more social housing units per capita. And Hong Kong was a capitalist superpower. So people know that housing isn't really the same as, a car. It's very, very different. Housing is absolutely necessary if you want people to be able to come to work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And,
Okay.
and that doesn't even touch on deep subsidy housing, which we've fallen dreadfully behind. And we know that the cost of looking after a homeless person is substantially more than if that party could be housed. So we're not, again, another silos. No one's talking to anybody on the other side of this argument. There are at least 14,000 known homeless people in Toronto, and that doesn't even, I don't think it includes families. Even to think that there's a homeless family is something that's completely unacceptable. And that person needs all kinds of support, never mind morally. It's a lot less costly to provide that support when they're housed.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's pivot to talk about your memos and the proposals that you outlined and articulated so well in there. What do we need? Weaving together the two memos that were sort of related but different, what do we need to get housing back on track?
I'm starting to see the parties getting a little closer, but they're still not in the same room. So the housing providers, as I said, everybody was vilified for a little while. And now everybody's starting to understand that we need to be in the same room. I haven't seen it yet, but it's getting closer. Our industry has a responsibility to be proactive also. I wrote today to the Deputy Minister of Housing explaining a problem on how it's substantially more difficult to build a rental building than it is to build a condominium building. And I think probably they're not aware of that. So the industry has an obligation to open book and show these are the problems that we have. And you need to help us mitigate because you don't know the problems that are actually on the ground in terms of from a business standpoint. So when I can actually say to you that people are around a table talking, which includes private sector and the banks, hasn't happened yet. That's when we can start to find solutions.
You talked a little bit about the idea of having a housing growth ombudsman in one of your memos. I would
Right.
love for you just to share your thoughts around that. What would that look like? How would that work? Why is that
Great.
not happening now?
I'm glad you asked because I like to be nonpartisan when my government's in place. And the election, it's a different story. But when someone gets elected, they're your government and you do everything you can to get it right. So once upon a time, we were in a similar quagmire. Again, not with all the tax burden. The tax burden has happened over the last 15 years and it's astronomical. There isn't another industry that is taxed up front. And if people actually realize that they're carrying on their mortgage built-in taxes that they didn't even know were there, I think that there'd be a lot more uproar that on $1 million home, you probably have a $600,000 tax bill by the time you pay off your mortgage. And that's in after-tax dollars. People only take the 30% of the $1 million home. They don't realize that they're paying for that for the whole life of their mortgage, and see what that costs on the other end. They'll be quite aghast. But back to the ombudsman, I believe it was Dale Martin under an NDP government that was put in at the City of Toronto to be a facilitator ombudsman for housing. And if you had a problem with your file and it was taking too long, you called him up on a hotline and you said, my file's stuck. I don't know where it is. I don't know what's happening. No one's responding. We need those kind of people.
And by a file, you mean like if you were like applying for approvals for development
Absolutely.
and it was sort of stuck in the siloed system that you talked about earlier.
And they accelerated the process.
I've had an idea as you were talking for a new Build Canada tool. I love ideas for new tools. And as you were talking, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we had a home tax calculator where people could go and put in the postal code of their home or condo and better understand in a transparent way how much taxes they're paying as part of that?
I hope we also do it so that we show how much it costs by the end of the life of your mortgage.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I'll take that back to the Build Canada team. You also, in your memos, talked about national zoning standards and called for national zoning standards. Curious to unpack that a little bit and get your thoughts on why you think Ottawa has a stronger role to play there.
I actually think that zoning standard, though, is high level because there are different sites, obviously, in the urban environment that are more difficult. You wouldn't be able to say the same things in an open greenfield as you would in a downtown urban context. But I think the criteria should be a checklist. There should be a checklist of does it accomplish this? Does it accomplish the goals? And then it should be fast tracked. For example, there isn't any excuse why any project on public transit takes more than 6 months to get approved. And that's something that can be accommodated. What also should happen is I actually had a building once that the structure of the building was so complex that they didn't have the facilities in the municipality to get it approved. And so they depended on the stamp of the engineer. Well, think about that. It makes a lot of sense that there's greater expertise outside of the system right now because the private sector advances because it needs to advance because of the arguments of efficiencies. So frankly, when you've got stamps from engineers, that should facilitate the processing time substantially. It shouldn't have to go through the exact same process again from municipal workers.
Yeah, that makes sense. It would make sense to streamline that. I'm surprised actually to hear that that isn't already
Right.
happening. Well, since we are talking about housing, it's funny / sometimes frustrating that people are sometimes confusing Build Canada with the new government initiative, Build Canada Homes. And I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to kind of get your take on Build Canada Homes, your thoughts about their approach, and what you how you reflect on what they're trying to do with that initiative.
So didn't love at the beginning. The good news is they're listening. If you make a call, they want to know what the private sector thinks. They want to fix it. Do I think that it's ridiculous that a minister says that he's going to take an industry that was leading North America into the future? Yes, I find that absolutely ridiculous. It means that the person doesn't understand how good the industry was. You can actually build very, very quickly in the city of Toronto when you're allowed to build. And we were building, if you'll recall, there were more cranes in the city of Toronto than any city in North America. So it's a little bit unfortunate when there's still that little game of let's blame someone. But what I would say is they're trying. And if they believe that the private sector is part of the solution, we're there to be there. Do I believe that all they're showing is low rise? Yes, that's a little worrisome. I appreciate everybody wants a low rise home, but we were already over 60% in Ontario of multi-unit res. So that will need some attention. When I heard about $12 billion, you need to understand that's not a lot of money for housing. And I think 55 billion went to battery plants. So if housing is really serious, $12 billion will not go very far.
You've been one of the few people in this debate who actually builds housing. There's lots of voices all with different opinions, but you are one who actually knows what it takes to build housing and has that decades-long experience in the system. After years of watching the system sort of get worse and worse from your vantage point, I'm curious what still gives you hope that we can turn things around and get to where we need to be with housing in this country.
Well, it's a vocation. I mean, that's not to get mushy, but seeing a school bus show up at a new building that you contributed to is an extraordinarily rewarding experience. And having people appreciate what you've built for them is an incredibly rewarding experience. So, being a city builder, I wouldn't change what I do. Do I believe that it's time now for everyone to get extremely serious because no one's been listening? I mean, how many times do we have to hear a developer can have one less Ferrari? Well, that's absolutely ridiculous. People have seen me with a construction hat working 7 days a week on a job site to get the job done. There are really great people in our industry, and it's time that our voice is heard. I also know how important housing is. I'm a capitalist. I know how important housing is to underpin the success of our country. So when we speak about high level projects and supporting high level industries, you need to understand that what housing does that very few other industries do is to support so many levels of small and medium sized business. And I'm still a heartfelt fan of small and medium sized business because I believe that's where employment training happens and that's where innovation starts. So what we're doing is also decimating an industry that was very factory built already, very efficient, and supported so many amazing factories in Ontario in particular and across the country. And to neglect that will be very consequential and to the negative.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up here with one final question. If listeners take away one idea from today's conversation, what should it be?
That we're still not at the table and it's urgent, keeping in mind that if you don't build in 2026, you have nothing in 2029. So you can't delay the conversation. The conversation should have been yesterday. You can't be thinking of, our industry is obsolete or our industry never innovated. That's complete nonsense. We have some of the most brilliant people in our industry, engineers, architects, innovators, manufacturing, carpenters, laborers. We have some of the highest safety standards in North America, and we've been able to support very good wages. Please call us to be at the table. We're still not there.
Urgency and collaboration. That's a great place to end off. Julie, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate everything that you do in your sector and your ongoing support for Build Canada. Thank you.